Hi, this is Vector Sequencer from Five12. It's a digital sequencer that lets you sequence up to 8 parts or tracks simultaneously with either a monophonic melody, chords, or drums, both over control voltage and also through multiple MIDI outputs. Vector doesn't do everything, but it does quite a few things that other sequencers just can't. In this video, I'll take a look at the things that make it special, what its workflow is like, and of course, pros and cons. Let's get started. Before we start, just a quick reminder that Vector is a sequencer. It doesn't make any sounds on its own. Vector can sequence modular and MIDI instruments using control voltage, USB MIDI, and MIDI over TRS-B 3.5mm jacks, and with an expander over regular 5-pin MIDI, and it also has DIN sync as well. Let's take a look at the module overall. The main hardware features are the 2 high-resolution OLED displays, which are clearly viewable from any angle and have a matte finish that prevents reflections, and the 8 per-step encoders, which let you change parameters on a per-step basis. The patterns themselves aren't limited to 8 steps. You can always move back and forth between screens using the previous and next buttons. You use the encoders to change individual parameters that are right above them, and you can use the 9th encoder for a bunch of different things, mainly for changing parameters at once. On the bottom is a 1-octave keyboard for step sequencing and for transposing patterns, as well as a few shift functions for selecting tracks in other modes, and the top row mostly lets you select which parameter it is that you're editing with the encoders on screen. So for example, now I'm editing pitch, but I can also edit gates, velocity, note length, ratchets, and if I double press a button, you sometimes see an additional row of parameters, for example, glide in this case, or groove in this case. In terms of connectivity, the main module without the optional expander has a pair of pitch, gate, and velocity outputs for sequencing 2 monophonic voices, though their assignment can somewhat be changed to send modulation through the velocity outputs. It has 2 TRS-B type MIDI outputs, and it comes with 2 dongles that let you connect it to regular MIDI if you want. It's got run, clock, and reset outputs, which can also be assigned to additional parameters, and it has both a USB type A host and a USB type B device input. This jack means that you can both connect and power a USB MIDI device like this, whether it's a controller or another synth, and you also have a USB device jack, both of which you can send and receive MIDI through. The optional jack expander gives you 4 additional pitch, gate, and velocity outputs, as well as 8 trigger outputs. These also have some input functionality, and then you've got 5-pin MIDI in and out and DIN sync in and out. The basic workflow is pretty straightforward. You've got 8 parts or tracks. In this project, I've got a lead part, chord part, and drum part, and I select them just by holding part and pressing the button under the part. So this is my drum track, part 5 is my chord track, and then part 1 is the lead line. Vector Sequencer also supports an Ableton Live style grid for tracks and scenes, meaning that each part can have up to 20 different clips or patterns, and you can define and then swap through scenes where each part plays a different pattern in each scene. The patterns are called presets here, so if I press the preset button, I can see that, for example, for part 1, I've got 6 different clips or presets. So if I just go ahead and maybe mute out the other tracks and just listen to part 1, okay, go into preset scenes. This is pattern number 1. This is pattern 2. Nothing's going on here. Let's maybe try pattern 9, which jumps to pattern 1. We'll get to that later. Pattern 10. And this is an additional pattern. You can change pattern names as well. So those are the different presets for a particular part or track, and then you also have scenes. So for example, in this first scene, part 1 is playing pattern A10, and part 5 is playing pattern A02. The drum pattern is A01, and you can select different scenes. Let's maybe launch this scene, and if I wanted to launch or go into this one, you do that with Shift Q currently. I think it makes more sense to press this button. Maybe that's a change that Jim can make. So this is scene 2, and then back to scene 1. Again, Shift Q. Of course, my drum parts are silent, so I can go ahead and unmute them. So those are presets and scenes. And I mentioned before that an individual pattern or preset can have more than 8 steps, up to 64 steps in an individual pattern, and you can chain patterns as well. More about that later. Let's say we go ahead to an empty pattern. Let's take a look at basic sequencing. When the notes are grayed out, you won't hear anything. I can hit run and nothing happens to the pattern. I can still change the notes if I wanted to. To make a note sound, I need to open up the gate. Let's maybe open up this gate a bit. And this gate, and this gate. So these are my 3 notes. I could of course change pitch like this. Another way to sequence notes is either using the built-in keyboard or an external one. So if I hit record, if I make sure I'm in step sequencing mode, which is step, and then choose the virtual keyboard, I can just punch in notes like this. Right. Then I can hit play. Notice these notes don't have gates yet. I can fix that with the 9th encoder. Then overwrite that if I wanted to. And like I mentioned before, I can also plug in an external keyboard into the USB type A jack, choose USB A, then sequence the pattern this way in real time as well. We'll get to chords later. You can't currently sequence chords using an external keyboard. I know that's a feature that's on Jim's radar. I'm going to disconnect this just so that it doesn't get in the way. While we're here, there are a few additional functions for the keyboard. Let me go back to the virtual keyboard. So aside from sequencing, you can also transpose. And also work in through mode, which just lets you play the notes directly. Now I'll go over all the sequence parameters in a bit. I just want to talk about routing. Once we've got our pattern in, you can route each part either through the CV outputs, through the MIDI outputs, or through the expander. You determine that in the globals menu. Here there are 3 basic sections and a few subtabs within each section. Routing is determined in section 3, and this is where you choose which output gets which part. So for example, here I've got the first voice, pitch, gate, and velocity using part 1 as a source. The second set uses part 2 and the drums, and then I can keep on scrolling to the right. Outputs 3 and 4 are these guys in the expander. This is 5 and 6. Run, clock, and reset are these 3. And you can also determine what gets sent to the expander triggers over here. Here I'm sending it the drums from part 6, going out of here into Squid Salmple. The piano chords you heard before are routed out MIDI number 1 into a computer that's nearby. It's the chord track being sent to MIDI output number 1 in channel 1. So you've got 16 channels here, and then control over MIDI output 2, and the host USB, USA to device, and of course the expander MIDI outputs as well. Okay, so let's go back to the pattern and check out the different pattern options that we have, or different pattern lanes. The first lane is pitch. Why don't I just simplify that by step sequencing a simple do, re, mi pattern for the first 3 notes. Why not? Let's just fill in the octave just so that it's clear what's going on. So this is our current pattern. I already mentioned that the second lane or layer for pitch is glides, which we can add, and add across the board as well if we like. Only 2 options here. Next up is gate. We talked about that as well. You can create ties by scrolling all the way to the right. And then a groove option will shift notes back and forth. Be shorten the gate here. So that's groove. Again, that can be controlled across the board as well. Next up, the velocity lane also does as you would expect. Lets you change velocity on a per note basis. Obviously, you need to route velocity out to something. Here I've got it patched into Ornament and Crime, which is both creating our envelopes and their depth. This Ornament and Crime, by the way, may look a little bit different. It's got these control knobs for various parameters, for example, to attack and decay here. It's a special version of Ornament and Crime called OCP, or Ornament and Crime Plus, which is currently only available as a through the whole DIY project. Anyway, back to the options here. The velocity page or tab has 3 other options, 3 MIDI CC lanes for sequencing MIDI CCs. Currently, there's no direct way to sequence control voltage, just CCs, at least not in the main sequence. We'll get to subsequences later on where you can sequence control voltage. Let's keep moving on. This is where this sequencer starts to get really interesting. So if I hit run, just turn down the delay here and straighten out the gates a bit. As you can hear, each step takes the same amount of time. The length and repeat options let you change that. So if I hit this and say, extend this step out to 3 steps, and this step to 2, and this step maybe to half, you can make a completely different groove on a per step basis here. Something which takes Vector completely off the standard sequencing grid. Repeat is the second option here. It's similar in that it also makes a step longer, but it will let you repeat a step. So let's say repeat this step twice. 5 times, twice for this one. That's for the sake of good order. Reset this and do the same for length. Next up is ratchets, which you may be more familiar with, which repeats a note either twice, 3 times, or 4 times, but all during the duration of a single step. I'll get to chants and modulation in a bit, which are slightly more advanced features. Next up is control, which lets you set the length of the sequence. So 1 step, up to 16 steps, which is the default length for a pattern. If you want, you can head on into globals and change the part length to either 32 or 64 steps. The reason you see these exclamation marks and a shift clear function to execute is that doing this will reduce the amount of presets you have available in your part. Typically, you've got 20 presets per part. If you increase the part length to 64 steps, you'll have only 6 presets. Let's just keep it at 16. Anyway, back to part control. Let's take a look at some of the other functions. Move this back to 8 steps. You can change the direction to backwards, a few alternate options, back and forth, random. Reset lets you reset the pattern after the number of beats you select. Rate lets you change the relative rate of this particular part, which is helpful for having each part play in a polyrhythmic relation to the other parts. And then mode lets you choose how you set the polyrhythmic relationship between parts. So the default is musical divisions, but you can also change it to percentage of a beat, or just overall speed. So plenty of polyrhythmic options as well as polymetric options with the pattern length. I won't go over all the modes here, but you can see there's quite a lot to play with. Let's just get things back to normal. And then you can also transpose the pattern, either whole octaves up and down, or semitones. While we're here on sequence controls, pressing here gives you a few other options like setting a custom key and scale for a particular part. Globals has overall scale and key control, and there are a few generative options, which we'll get to later on. And the last tab lets you set the actual control change or CC destinations for the CC lanes. And PQNT is preset quantization, sets whether presets change immediately or on the next bar when you change presets on the preset scene page. Okay, let's clear this part out and move on to chord part types. I'll unmute my chord part and head on into it. Chord parts let you play up to 4-note chords. There are a few limitations both to chord and drum parts. They can only live in parts 5 through 8, and on a per part basis, like I mentioned, you can either sequence 4 notes or trigger 4 different drum samples or sounds. You can either program custom chords, and you've got a few preset options which you change using the encoder under the chord or under the step. So the first option is just 1 note, and then you've got a few 2-note or dyad options. Then up to a few triads, major, minor, and so on, augmented, diminished, sustained. And then 7th chords, major, minor 7th, half diminished, So those are the built-in options. There's no support for inversions or spread chords, which would be nice, but you can enter any custom 4-note chord with any interval up to 60 semitones. If you hold the edit button and push the encoder, it moves it into semitone mode, and then you can determine the individual notes of your chord. Let's take this way up. Okay, so it can go pretty far. You can see the octaves symbolized in here. Let's push it all the way up. The piano can't play that note. And you can move between the notes like this. So a bit clunky. Currently, I asked Jim about this, and he indeed mentioned that in the future, an update which will let you enter chords either using this keyboard or an external one would make entering chords much simpler. Let's get this back to normal and move on to drum parts. I'll go ahead and mute the chord part, unmute drums, and go to my drums. So this is the pattern that I have here. Like I mentioned before, you can always go ahead and enter a new pattern for a fresh start. And the controls here are pretty similar in terms of length and direction and so on. I've not patched level here. I'm just setting levels on Squid Salmple or Salmple. You can sequence up to 4 drums here. They're named by default: bass drum, snare, hi-hat or closed hat, and open hat. Obviously, you could trigger any sound you want with this. You can sequence drums just by increasing the level of the individual notes. Or another neat trick is if you press the mute button, then you can use these to sequence additional events. So say if I wanted to layer hi-hats, just do like this. And yeah, pretty straightforward drum sequencing. And you're not limited to just sending drum triggers over CV. You can send them over MIDI as well. You can pretty simply map which voice goes to which note, and you can even change its name if you like. Anyway, now that we're familiar with sequencing basics, let's look at some advanced options like chance and modulation. Chance lets you add random variability to a step in a pattern. For any given step, you can choose a single parameter to randomize and then select the probability that that event will occur. So let's say, for example, that I wanted step number 2 to ratchet randomly. I'd go into the chance parameter. Let's get this going. Go into chance, look for the ratchet option. Let's make it 3 ratchets. Then hit this again to set the probability. Over here, it's at around 50%. Okay, so it'll ratchet every now and then. I can also choose to have it happen every even bar, or odd bars, or every 3rd bar, 4th bar, and so on. A few options there. Currently, by the way, this every bar option happens literally every bar. It doesn't happen every loop. I spoke with Jim about this. He's aware of it and is considering adding a second option to have the probability dice rolled every loop cycle rather than every bar. The parameters that you can activate for chance, the types are, let's go back to the beginning, either mutes or unmutes, which is this, skip steps or unskip step. If the step is being skipped, jump backwards, anywhere, and forwards. Then there are a few velocity options, a few gate and tie options. We talked about ratchets before, 2, 3, or 4. And then you've got drum part mutes, drum voice mutes, voice swaps. And if this were a pitch track, let's move to our pitch part, then you can randomize semitones up and down as well. Those are very quickly the randomization options. Chance ops, by the way, are non-destructive. So if I go back into my drum pattern and then just turn everything down, then the pattern will go back to being as it was before. I mention this because we also have sequence operations which are destructive. So let's talk about sequence ops or sequence operations. You access these by holding Shift and pressing any of these buttons. So if I go into part 1, for example, and let's say that I set it to a 4-step part, and then say open up some gates and go back to pitch and maybe set this. So double will, as you might expect, Shift double the pattern. And there are a few options here which I won't go through, but the interesting part is what I skipped before, which is all the generative modes. So there are quite a few of these. I won't go through all of them individually, but if I hit run here and maybe get our notes back to normal. So now this is acid 1, and if I hit Shift and generate, it'll generate a new pattern. Obviously I don't have an acid type sound here. So this is, for example, acid 1, and certainly this isn't an acid tempo. Acid 2 I think also does glides. Let's do this. Okay, so that's that. And there are a few other options here. Again, I won't go through all of them. These are Berlin School options. Oops. Hit this. Hang on, sorry. This needs delay, of course. Let's try Berlin 2. Shift Gen. Okay, and you can continuously hit those. So, can be nice or not. It's up to you. There are other options here. Again, I won't go through all of them. Euclidean is cool too. Anyway, so that's for the melodic parts. The drum parts also have their own generators. So let's go into part 6, the drum part. Let's see what we've got here. So start here, cell 1. Now I have no idea what's going to happen. This is my current drum pattern. Shift generate. So yeah, anything goes here. Let's try a different type. Okay, so we got here. Very nice. Let's try maybe Euclidean. Generate a few of these. So nice, interesting generative options here. Not a lot of specific control. Yeah, I think that's, let's try these. Sparse, I guess. Totally random. Are we up for this? Also pretty nice. So if you're out of ideas, this may be an interesting option for you. If you want more subtle randomization, by the way, let's go back to part 1. There's the Evo option. So if we hit here, right, there's medium, low, or high Evo. Let's start with low, hit run. These are our pitches. Evo is over here, shift Evo. It will gradually evolve the pattern. Let's take risks, go to high, evolve. And right now, yeah, interesting results. I don't have this locked into a scale, I think. If I go into globals here, yeah, we're chromatic, but I could easily change to, say, a minor scale. A bunch of scale options here as well. And you could continue generating and evolving the pattern this way. And if you've messed up your pattern too much, you could always reload an existing pattern. Let's go for this guy, reload. Let's move on to what I think is one of the most interesting and original concepts in Vector, and that is its subsequencers. You get 2 of these per part, and this may be a little bit complex, but bear with me, it's worth it. You get to the subsequencers by pressing the modulation button. You've got 2 of them, subsequence 1 and subsequence 2. Each of them has up to 8 steps. So these are the steps for subsequence 1. These are the steps for subsequence 2. What the subsequences are basically LFOs that act on one of the main track parameters. So I'll turn these off. This is the pattern that I played at the beginning of this video. So now both subsequences are off. Let's take a look at my original pattern. It's this guy, but really if I hit play and maybe mute these parts, turn down the delay for a second, it's really just randomly going between these different steps. That's because we have a chance op of randomness for the steps. So why don't I turn this off, including the probability. So maybe it goes through it a bit cleaner. So just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Very simple. There's some filter modulation going on here, but a very simple pattern overall. Now we could affect changes to a number of parameters in this pattern using the subsequences. So one of the options is to transpose it. And I've got a sequence of 3 steps here. I could make it up to 8 steps. Let's keep it at 3. And if I hit play, nothing happens because all the values are set to 0. But if I start messing with these, let's say go here, and maybe have this go to -7, then you can see it slowly goes through this sequence of transposing the main sequence, the pitch of the main sequence. And you could set different rates for this. Let's go back to subsequence 1. Okay, so now it's here, but I can make it go faster or slower if I wanted, which can be a complete mess. But here it works pretty nicely. So that's one example of a subsequence modulating one of the sequence parameters. I've got 2 of these. Let's move on to subsequence number 2. And this guy, I don't want to transpose. I want it to, you know what, let's transpose but change octaves. So there are 4 steps here. Let's also make this, you know what, let's make this pretty fast and go into the sequence itself. Okay, you can see its rate. It's happening alongside our main sequence at the rate of the main sequence. It's not doing anything yet, but let's maybe transpose this one an octave up, this one an octave down, this one maybe 2 octaves up. So it's going ahead and basically creating a new pattern. Let's maybe just leave this at 1, where the main pattern is being transposed an octave up or down based on this. Let's maybe change its rate to slower. Slower. Okay, so both of these are now impacting the main sequence, and we can go crazier and not change octaves, but change the rate if we wanted. So let's maybe do that. Obviously, anything can happen here when we change rates like this. And then there's direction option as well. Start point 2, so let's change direction midway. And then go ahead and maybe have the sequence go backwards a bit, and then maybe randomize a bit for a while, and go backwards again. And you can see that impact the way the sequence is running. So those are the subsequencers. There's a third option in the modulation page or tab, and that is mod CV inputs. Maybe let's load up the original project over here. So what this does is let you take a mod source. In this case, I've got planar 2 here sending voltage into input number 1. And if I run this pattern, go into the drum part, and then head into a different drum preset, you can see I'm controlling ratchets here. So joystick over here has no ratchets. Joystick over here gradually adds ratchets. And that's because the modulation is sent to target probability from external input number 1 at the amount of 100. You could set a mod depth as well. And if I wanted to, I could also set the y-axis to modulate something else. Anything from transposition to whatever. But yeah, that's a pretty cool functionality of the mod inputs. Let's move on. We already talked about presets and scenes before. Okay, so these are my 2 drum presets. And we talked about scenes as well, where you can swap multiple clips across multiple parts simultaneously. But a cool feature that I mentioned that is available before is similar to Ableton Live's follow actions. Now you edit this by hitting the edit button, and then you can determine that, let's say, preset number 2, instead of playing forever, will rather say play for 1 bar and then go to preset number 1 and repeat once, which is fine. Let's check this out in action. So I want preset number 2, and you can see this little arrow here, which is sort of its follow action. And I hit run. You can see this is queued up, and then it moves to preset number 1. I think these follow actions or playlists are yet another really cool feature of Vector. Let's talk about a few other miscellaneous options. If you hit parts, you've seen me use this to mute and unmute the different parts. Another really nice functionality that this has, if you hit next, this will let you control an individual parameter across multiple parts. So for example, here we can control the start point for each of the parts. And if you press this button, you can see you can control other parameters, transpose each of the parts, either octaves or semitones. And you can also scale the gates and velocity if you turn encoder number 9. There are many more features I won't cover here. Just one last cherry on top is that you can use these inputs to step through different sequences in different parts using external clocks. Okay, so that's Vector in a nutshell. Let's take a look at the pros and cons. On the cons side, which is of course also Vector's pro, you should realize this isn't a traditional piano roll style sequencer, but rather one that's designed with modular style sequences in mind, meaning patterns that are designed to change and evolve in many different ways as opposed to just doing what they're told and play a certain pattern from start to finish. Digging a bit more deeper into the details, there are features that I'd like to see in here that don't currently exist, and these should be taken as such. Jim is releasing new features with every new firmware update, so my ideas can be prioritized with anybody else's. I mentioned these before. I'd love to be able to sequence chords using an external keyboard or this keyboard rather than programming them semitone by semitone. Also, while you can route MIDI to CV in record mode, once you exit record mode, that no longer works. It would be nice if this would function as a general MIDI to CV controller that would let you play notes using this keyboard or this keyboard as the pattern is running. Another overall con, these are on-off switches. There's obviously no expressive control when using them. You'll need to modulate any expression you want. And you can do that, of course, with a sequencer. There are other limitations that I mentioned before, for example, that currently probabilities or chance work on a per bar basis and not loop cycle, and that you can't sequence control voltage directly into the pattern, only CCs, but you can send subsequence values out as control voltage through the velocity outputs of the different voices. One final wish list feature that I know isn't going to be easy, but it would be nice if you could set different lengths for each of the lanes. So for example, I could set an 8-step length for the pitch lane, but maybe set the rhythm or the length to a 3-step pattern. This way you can establish a certain short groove and play longer sequences on top of that. Finally, regarding price, the main module is priced at $700 and the expander at $360. While I don't think that it's unfairly priced compared to what it can do and compared to the Eurorack market overall, it's certainly a premium product in terms of absolute numbers as compared to non-Eurorack sequencers. Now, all that said, on the pros side, this is probably the most feature-rich Eurorack sequencer I've ever seen, that despite the fact that it has a lot of features, has struck a proper balance between power and ease of use. Now, obviously it does have a lot of layers and options, but what makes it usable is the large high-resolution display and direct control with the encoders. It's easy to see at a glance what each layer contains, and I didn't feel that anything here was more complex than it needed to be. While it does have a learning curve, I think that overall, once you get it, it's simple and fun to make music with and has enough modulation sources and destinations to keep a very interesting dialogue going between you and it. The amount of output options is outstanding considering its size, and by no means should you view it just as a modular sequencer. Vector can easily handle a non-Eurorack setup with hardware and software synths if you put it in a case like Pods by 4MS. Also, it seems that Jim at Five12 is committed to future firmware updates. I've asked him about my cons, and it seems like many of them will be addressed in the near future, as well as a few very interesting new features like using a launchpad as a sequencer. So that's it for Vector. If you want to learn more about Eurorack as well as a bunch of other electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, check out my book available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below, and don't forget to ring the bell after hitting subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.